Shall we kick off, Hussein?
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, friends. This is my pleasure to welcome you to this first session or first webinar of the Nexus Dialogues on the issue of subsidies. This is the topic that has been in the environmental agenda for a while. It is a very complex topic. There has been a lot of work around it. There has been some success stories, but also some disappointments. We have made some progresses in certain areas, such as biodiversity. We have sort of the climate change agenda that makes this topic even more appealing. And at the same time, we have the socio-economic challenges of countries, especially coming out of the COVID. We have the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals that requires faster and agile and more agile reaction for them to be realized. So this discussion comes very timely, and we are very much honored that...
No, sì, vai, tranquilla, tanto io qua devo solamente ascoltare.
Colleagues, if you could please mute your microphones, that would be great. So that's an honor for us to have been able to gather a set of colleagues in this discussion, in this Nexus Dialogue series. The proposal has been initiated by our distinguished representative from Switzerland. Switzerland has been a key player, a donor, a contributor to the environmental agenda at large, but also specifically to the Environment Management Group. We are very much privileged to have this contribution and support, and also privileged to have distinguished representative from Switzerland, His Excellency Felix Viertli, the Ambassador of Environment for Switzerland, with us. We have also a set of speakers coming from the United Nations, and also we have Stephen Stone with us, who will be moderating this discussion, taking from me. And we are honored for all of you, and privileged to have such a distinguished set of presenters here. This discussion will continue, actually will take place in 3 series. The first one is today, will focus on public spending and the whole sort of basic elements of this important topic, trying to bring a good understanding of the topic itself, some good sort of studies of the sort of both successes but also the challenges. I think we also have the discussion on the definitions, because there is also some misunderstanding about the topics of subsidies or misperception that we would like to clarify out of this presentation. The second one will focus on the methodologies for measuring the impact of the subsidies, and the third one will very much focus on the case studies. We would like to deepen our understanding out of this dialogue, share knowledge, develop possible strategies or common language or narrative, especially in the UN system, and producing perhaps guidances that would allow us to understand this topic coherently and apply it also in our programs and activities, and be able also to create a community of practice. In preparing for this dialogue, we benefited a lot from the colleagues in UNEP Economy Division, Joy, and the other colleagues, Assad, and the others, who have actually given us certain background information about where we are with this work so far. So very much thankful to all of them. But we very much like also to build on this and create that community practice, and hopefully make sure that this understanding has been created in the United Nations system. The Environment Management Group is very much pleased to bring 52 UN organizations together to bring a collaboration and cooperation in the field of environment, implementation of the SDGs, environmental dimensions. And we're very much grateful for those of you who have been able to come to this dialogue. I don't want to take a lot of time here. We will have a number of good presentations. We would like to really animate this discussion with those who have attended. Please raise your hands, raise your questions. Of course, Stephen will bring those sort of asks to the table later on. I would like to stop here after welcoming you, really thanking again those panelists who have been able to join us, and pass it from here to His Excellency Felix Viertli to give us his opening remarks. Felix, we are so much thankful to you to have been able to participate and to have been able to sort of take the initiative and raise this issue with us as an important topic for our discussion this year. Over to you, Felix.
Thank you very much, Hossein, and good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Government of Switzerland, I would like to welcome you all to today's opening webinar on this Nexus Dialogue series on the critical theme of repurposing subsidies. As also outlined by Hossein, we'll hear more about that. This is absolutely a key issue that we have to address to achieve the SDGs. And it's a pleasure to see such a diverse and also numerous public attending this webinar today. I would like first to thank EMG for organizing this webinar series, which addresses critical environmental challenges. The staggering $7 trillion that is spent on environmentally damaging subsidies is evidence of the urgent need for change. Not only these subsidies exacerbate climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution, they also bring public spending out of line with our SDGs. In 2022, annual nature negative investments were more than 30 times larger than financing for nature-based solutions, according to the latest UNEP State of Finance for Nature report. With this in mind, it is vital that we recognize the importance to reassess our priorities. We also know that the issue is not new. No, in 2010, in the IG targets of the CBD, the parties already agreed to target on it. I quote, the target was to reform, phase out and eliminate incentives harmful to biodiversity by 2020. However, we have to admit that little was achieved. So we have still the same target now. It has been quantified in the GBF that we have adopted in 2022 under the CBD. And target 18 of the GBF reads now that we want to collectively reform, phase out and eliminate subsidies harmful for biodiversity and reduce them by $500 billion a year. So this paints a really bleak picture, both in terms of the scale of the problem, as well as in terms of country success or rather failure to address the issue. But we have also examples that we see that times are changing. And this dialogue, we will explore the vast potential of regulating and repurposing subsidies to foster sustainable and equitable economy. I'm happy to provide two examples from Switzerland, how we are trying to address those issues. The first one is on a domestic level. Switzerland has started to act on its commitment several years ago. First, a study was conducted to identify harmful incentives. Since then, the most harmful subsidies and those most amenable to reforms have been identified. The proposal on how to reform, phase out, or eliminate them are being finalized and are expected to be approved by our government in the coming months. Yet the work will not stop there. Any additional harmful subsidies are expected to be examined and reform proposals elaborated. Moreover, Switzerland also reviews all its subsidies every 6 years. The review includes an environmental impact assessment of the subsidy under scrutiny. The second example is more international. Switzerland has been supporting BioFin, the UNDP managed global program, since its outset. BioFin supports countries identifying their biodiversity financing needs, in scaling up financing for biodiversity, and identifying and repurposing harmful subsidies. Switzerland has funded BioFin works in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Element of the work was to monitor and repurpose biodiversity harmful subsidies, among others. Based on this practical work in Kyrgyzstan and also in other countries, BioFin developed a step-by-step guide to repurpose subsidies harmful to biodiversity and improve their impacts on people and nature. These are just two concrete examples on how to work to reduce harmful subsidies in favor of biodiversity, to address change by climate change and other environmental objectives. As we embark on this dialogue series, we have the opportunity to discuss how such models can be adapted and implemented globally. Engagement in robust participation and open stakeholder dialogues to explore effective strategies and best practices, as well as collaboration across sectors and nations, are essential to ensure impactful and lasting changes. I'm confident the discussions and the knowledge sharing will significantly contribute to the SDGs and improve international policy making, including further in future UNEA sessions and other global forums. So thank you very much again for the opportunity to be a part of the panelists, to speak here today, and very much for organizing these webinars. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bertley. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for framing the discussion. And Hussein, thank you for opening. I'll pick up from here, from your very good introduction, Hussein, and Ambassador Bertley. Thank you so much for framing the importance of the discussion, because here we're really talking about not only impacts on nature, which I think we all care about very much, but also the flow of public funds. And, you know, as we were kicking off the discussion, I was thinking earlier today, you know, we're in a very interesting period of time in some ways, because for most of the current generation life, we have been in low inflation, low interest rates, and pretty much easy money, cheap money, low interest rates. And that has really changed in the past 3 years with COVID, with inflation, with high interest rates. The cost of capital has increased, the cost of money has increased, and the premium on fiscal space that countries have to manage is tighter than ever. And yet, ironically, as COVID hit, we know that many price caps came into play. There was food price spikes, there were fuel price spikes, and actually outlays on a lot of these subsidies increased over time. So at the same time that there's a greater premium on the fiscal space, there's more pressure for some of these subsidies. And so, Ambassador, to hear your case from Switzerland is very revealing. In a sense, every 6 years, you're looking at the impacts of the subsidies. It sounds like a very, very healthy approach. And today we'll hear from other speakers who have country examples, particularly Mariana, the country examples that you might bring to the table from BioFin, but also the expertise we are going to hear from Katja, who will give us an overview of spending on different types of spending that affect biodiversity from OECD, from David Vivas from UN Trade and Development. I have to get used to your new name, David. The impact on oceans and fisheries in particular. And then we'll end up with Philip from IASD, who's going to tell us a bit about the fossil fuel subsidies that are out there and what they do to prices, the price landscape, which eventually impacts heavily on climate, impacts heavily on nature, and impacts heavily on the pollution space as well, because all of these things are related. So the conversation we're having today is about fiscal policy. It is about public expenditure, but it's also in the frame of increasing number of shocks that hit our financial and economic systems through the environment, because we are more aware today than ever that the environment is material. I'm hoping it will be interactive. We have a series of 4 presentations, colleagues who will be presenting, and we will kick it off with you, Katja. Are encouraged to keep it short, sharp, and then there'll be a space to come up for air in case colleagues, you in the audience, have a burning question for Katja on her presentation, and then we'll move to the next one. So from Katja, we move to David, and then from David, we move to Mariana, who will tell us about the country examples, and then Philip, at the end, we come to climate, which in a way, I wouldn't call it the elephant in the room, but I would call it very much a presence, particularly given all the extreme weather events that we've been seeing over the past, well, months, days, weeks, even years. So with that, colleagues, thanks very much. And Katja, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation to participate in this UN EMG meeting. Kavar, if you could please share the slides. Thank you. So my name is Katja Karasakis. I'm in the Environment Directorate and lead the biodiversity work. I'll be covering work that was undertaken in our team, if you like, but also highlighting work from across the OECD that is relevant. So I'm also very grateful to inputs on this presentation from the Trade and Agriculture Directorate. Next slide, please. Just a very quick introduction. We're not the UN organization, we are the OECD, slightly different. 38 member countries and 5 key partners. We provide evidence-based policy analysis, we collect data and provide a platform for exchange of best practices. There are a number of different committees at the OECD. We're sort of structured a bit like a national government with an environment ministry, agriculture, etc. And just to highlight that the OECD Biodiversity Program, previous slide, focuses on the design of effective policies for the protection of biodiversity, on biodiversity finance, on mainstreaming biodiversity across sectors, and also on data and indicators. And we've been supporting the work of the Convention on Biological Diversity for a number of years. In terms of the international context for aligning public spending for climate and biodiversity, which is the purpose of this particular series, the part 1 of the series, there have been multiple calls and commitments to align public spending with climate and biodiversity objectives. I've highlighted here the overarching international frameworks, the Sustainable Development Goals, 12C, 14.6, with a language on fossil fuels, on fisheries, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that Felix also just highlighted, also in terms of aligning all financial flows, which is Goal D, targets 14 and 18, etc. And also through G20 and G7, etc. So there have been a number of calls and also commitments by various governments to try and move forward, make progress on this issue. Next slide, please. I've put up front some of the sort of the key steps and what some of the key challenges are in terms of the need to identify and reform environmentally harmful subsidies and support. And it's based on the work that we've done across OECD. Some of the key steps are first to identify and assess what is environmentally harmful. And at the OECD, we tend to use the word support because of the definitional issues with subsidies that Stephen also referred to before, covering other things too. The need to prioritize measures for reform and to also analyze the implications of these types of reforms on economic, on environmental, and on social impacts to see what the full scale of impacts are likely to be, to develop appropriate reform packages, and then to monitor and evaluate ex post to see have your reforms been successful, could they be adapted and improved over time, etc. And in terms of, I mean, there are many challenges, but perhaps some areas of where further sort of analytical work can also be taken is to better understand the local environmental impacts of subsidies as well as their reform. We tend to talk about these in a very general form, environmentally harmful support, environmentally harmful subsidies, but it's also important to understand possible different trade-offs between climate, what are the actual impacts on biodiversity, if you reform a subsidy in one country. Also, the second point here, what are the likely implications at the global levels, etc. So related to potential leakage implications, etc. But this is just a big, quick picture thing, sort of a snapshot. I've highlighted here a number of different reports that are relevant from across the OECD, going back to 2005, other more recent work, and I'll talk about a few of these. I'll just provide snapshots of some of these, given the time constraints. But at the very end, I'd also like to highlight that the OECD collects data on agriculture support from across 54 countries, support to fisheries across 40 countries. The number of countries might not sound very large, but it's actually like a massive proportion of global value added, etc. So they are important countries in that regard. The fiscal costs of support to fossil fuels, and we also collect data on policy instruments for the environment, to which more than 130 countries contribute to, and that also includes the positive incentives. So yes, lots of discussion on reforming the harmful incentives, but just to note that Target 18 also talks about the need to scale up the positive incentives. So how do we address the negative externalities by instruments such as pollution taxes, fees and charges, tradable permits, etc. And I'll speak to that very briefly at the very end. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start off with a study we released just before CBD COP15. It was called Identifying and Assessing Subsidies and Other Incentives Harmful to Biodiversity. And there, what we specifically did is we tried to identify what national level assessments exist. So at the national level, Switzerland is one of them. So very happy to hear, Felix, we covered your report. at that time, we found 23 national level studies that had tried to do something like this, that were harmful to biodiversity and also, or to the environment, rather. And the studies spanned 12 countries. The countries are listed here, as well as 2 regions. The idea was to focus on biodiversity, but only 8 of them focused specifically on biodiversity. So we broadened the scope to also look at how they identified environmentally harmful subsidies and support. And we did a comparative review of the approaches, the methodologies, what type of data they used, the processes that were involved. Was it desk research? Did they go broader surveys, interviews, etc.? And at the very end, we tried to develop good practice insights for any other country that wishes to do similar national level assessments. This is called for under Target 18, as the first part of the target says to identify by 2025 the incentives, including subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity. So that was sort of the impetus of the paper. Next slide, please. And there, in terms of the good practice insights, we identified 4 steps to identify and assess these subsidies that are potentially harmful. First, scoping, to define the types of subsidies and other incentives that are harmful that should be covered in the analysis. Screening, to identify the incentives that are, in fact, that are potentially harmful to biodiversity. Data gathering, which is a resource-intensive process, talking to various ministries to collect the data, etc. And the final step is to actually assess the extent of harm to biodiversity by these types of subsidies and other incentives. So this is, in a sense, the first step to identify and assess subsidies. And then after that, separately, we didn't cover it in this report, is how you go about prioritizing for reform and proceeding sequentially as needed. And the paper is available here in the link on the website. Next slide, please. We had also done some work earlier on the political economy of biodiversity policy reform, and looked at 4 case studies there of recent reform in terms of biodiversity policy. This was broader than just environmentally harmful support, but one of the case studies was on that support, also from Switzerland, in fact. And from the different insights and lessons across these case studies, we developed 6 key lessons for effective biodiversity policy reform. And I think that they also resonate very strongly also in the context of EHS, which I've outlined here. I won't go through them all in the interests of time, but they include building alliances between economic and environmental interests, seizing opportunities. Like in a number of cases, we found that the reforms don't actually take place only driven by environmental motivations, if you like, but for other reasons. And so it's important to be ready to have the data there, the analysis there, to be able to then make the case on why it's also good to make maybe some further changes that have improvements for the environment as well. Next slide, please. I'm afraid I'm going to have to run very quickly through the rest, which is the sectoral analysis of environmental impacts. I'm just going to highlight the work that we do have, and I'll leave it then up for the audience if they're interested in finding further information via the links. Next slide, please. So every year, the OECD releases the OECD Agricultural Policy Monitoring and Evaluation Reports. I mentioned it covers the 54 countries. Every year, they try to also focus on a different particular theme, with a 23 edition on climate change adaptation. It's built also off of the OECD database on producer support estimates of agriculture support. This highlights how the data is structured with total support, with PSE, consumer support estimates, the budgetary transfers, market transfers, etc. It's getting a bit technical, but it's a structure to show you how it works in general. Next slide, please. A little bit more technicalities on the different, the way that the data is then classified. Next slide, please. And then here you have the agriculture support based on the latest 2 years, 2020 to 2022, and averages, and by their different types, sort of structured in different ways. And it's also important to see, for example, market price support is not a budgetary transfer. It's a policy measure. So it's the value of, it's the monetary sort of value of that market price support. But in general, when we're talking about reforming or repurposing subsidies, where there is a lot of talk about this, it's a fraction of this total amount that can actually be, that is actually cash or transfers that can be repurposed into something else, for something else. Next slide. Also the work of the OECD on fisheries, with the reviews that come out, in this case, every 2 years. And in the 2022 version, they developed a framework. Next slide, please. I'll be done. I'm going to go over very quickly. A framework to identify the risk of encouraging unsustainable fishing in the absence of effective fisheries management. So based on the different types of government support to fisheries, under the assumption of absence of effective fisheries management, what is likely to be high risk, moderate risk, uncertain, or no risk? And here you see an example of how that comes up when you put it in the data format. Next slide, please. Another slide looking at this over countries. These are just snapshots to give you an idea. And very finally, I'd also like to highlight on our work on positive incentives, because it's an extremely important element as well that we need to also not forget. And at the OECD, on a regular basis, I would say not every year, generally every 2 years, we release a report on tracking economic instruments and finance for biodiversity. These economic instruments include taxes, fees and charges, tradable permits, the environmentally motivated subsidies, and we're soon also going to be adding data on payments for ecosystem services. We'll be updating this work in 2024, so this coming year, in advance of COP16. Next slide, please. And here you just see a little bit of breakdown. We also collect data on the finance that these instruments mobilize. And here you just have a little snapshot on the biodiversity relevant taxes, the revenue that they've generated in the OECD countries, as an example here. And I've gone over time, so thank you so much. And if there are any questions, I'll have the moderator, however you want to organize that, Stephen, afterwards. Thank you so much again.
Super. Thank you, Katja. Thank you for the excellent overview. And also thank you for keeping time. I have warned colleagues who are listening that if you have a burning question, this is a chance when you can come in. You need to raise your hand, your virtual hand, and perhaps throw on your camera. Or you can throw them into the chat box, because we also need to know that you're out there and you're alive and you're interested. Katja, I do have a question for you. You mentioned the six key lessons for subsidy reform. I'm wondering if there's any common pitfalls that you came across. Are there things that, you know, just sort of happen that can be avoided as well?
So I just want to be clear, that report wasn't only on subsidy reform, but it resonates a lot with other work that have focused on fisheries subsidy reform. So we also looked at subsidies reform in that report. I just want to be clear, just to avoid on the pitfalls. I actually think, I mean, because when we looked through those, when we did the analysis for that, we went to countries and spoke to multiple stakeholders from different ministries, NGOs, unions, etc., to hear, you know, their different perspectives and things like that. And I don't think there's one pitfall. I think in every situation and you'll come up with different ones. And the point is, I think you need to be ready, and you need to get the best data possible, learn from others' pitfalls as well, to see how they address things. So we came up with these 6, you know, the key lessons, and I would say maybe per case study, maybe 3 were most relevant, but the different 3s, if you like, 3 here, another 3 there. So I don't have a clear answer to your question. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I think we can probably imagine some sort of worst case scenarios that we've seen in the news from time to time. But I guess the reflection is, it's probably a lot easier to put a subsidy into place than it is to take it down. And Philip, I'm thinking of some of the early work of the Global Subsidy Initiative, Peter Wooders and others who contributed in that space. So just something for us to think about. What's the exit strategy? What's the sunset strategy, particularly when we're talking about repurposing? So David, we'll come to you next. David's with UN Trade and Development, and he will tell us a bit more about subsidies as they impact on the oceans. David, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will be sharing the screen on a presentation. Give me 2 seconds. Just let me know if it can be seen.
Yep, we're getting your screen.
Do we get it big enough?
Not in presentation mode yet, but visible.
Okay, let me check on presentation. Hold 1 second.
Yeah, perfect.
Is it working now? Perfect. Thank you very much. I will be going on the issue of fishery subsidies. The lady from the OECD has already mentioned some elements, but the importance of this is especially relevant in terms of a precedent. We have had the WTO subsidies agreement for more than 4 decades, and now that we had the recently the adoption of the WTO fishery subsidies agreement, but that's an important precedent because it's the first trade agreement that considers sustainability at the core of the rules and not trade distortiveness, which was the main element in the past. So I'm going to go deep in explaining what's the status and where negotiations are going and what lessons can we draw from it. There are certain things that are not common knowledge, but that define a lot how subsidies are used in the case of fisheries. First, people is not very aware that there are no taxes for selling or buying marine fuels in the high seas because it's unregulated. There is no state there to regulate. You apply it usually in the country itself or in the economic exclusive zone. So there is a lot of trade with no taxes and low prices in the high seas, both for marine transport, bunker fuels, but also for fisheries, also marine diesel. So this is very important because this is totally unregulated today. And the fishery subsidies agreement actually, and in negotiation, deal with some of these elements, but not all of the elements that are there. The second point that I think is important to discuss is that status of the fish stocks show significant fatigue. There are high levels of depletion. We all know that. But sometimes people don't know how deep this is. And I'll give an example. Over the last 20 years, the reports of total catch of marine fishery has been between 90 to 92, 93 million tons. This is the ceiling. We cannot expand that catch unless there is super sustainable management. And even if we do that, we may only catch 3 or 4 more million tons per year. So what happens is that we reach the limit. There is no more fish in the planet. And that 90 million tons of marine capture just supply half of the demand. The other half of the demand is coming from aquaculture. So imagine that all our oceans are providing today only half of the fish we eat. So this is important because this is perhaps the last wild harvesting economic activity we have at hand, and it's not enough. So very significant call for concern. As we all know, there are significant amount of fishery subsidies, and I will give some data that it's very well known. There are some data from academia, especially from Somalia and the University of British Columbia, talking about 30 billions in total, 35 billions in total of fishery subsidies, of which 20 could be harmful. Here we have more recent data of the OECD, by the way, that spoke before, but looking at all subsidies by about 40 OECD members that have notified or that have been somehow reporting. So it's official data. These are not estimates. These come from the countries, so it's more relevant in that sense. It's more accurate. And we could see that for a period of time between 2014 and 16, the subsidies were coming down on the sector of fisheries. This includes good and bad subsidies, by the way. It's all public fishery support. However, we start seeing in the data notify that subsidies are coming up again. okay, up to 2020, and they could still come up again in 2021 and potentially in 2022 due to the COVID and post-COVID effect, because it was necessary to sustain fishers while they were lockdown measures. So basically the subsidies are not yet coming down in value. We have a new WTO treaty from 2022 that it's gonna help, but it's not enough. We are in the ongoing negotiations on outstanding issues, but the upward trend is of concern, no? In economic terms, even if some of these subsidies are for good purposes. Now, next slide. Let me just move to the next slide. Now, this is another angle only on one aspect of the data that we could find. That obviously one of the areas that is more concerns about fuel subsidies, because they don't only create overcapacity, but also pollute, you know, in terms of CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. Marine diesel is one of the marine bunker fuels are some of the most polluting fuels, more than kerosene for planes and other, in terms of other particles. Now, we can see here that there is still significant amount of tax fuel concessions, meaning countries do not tax in any form marine fuel in 4 OECD countries today, okay? And this, including until 2021. And this is about amounts of tax concessions of about $350 to $400 million. It's not a lot, but these are subsidies that are not needed, that could be harmful in various sustainability terms, in terms of stocks, but also in terms of emissions. And they're still there. And let's hope we can phase them down, but it's always important to zoom in, because we don't realize that subsidies are not always active, but can be passive. While I'm charging taxes to fuels for cars, I'm not charging taxes for maritime transport and for fisheries, which may be a significant problem that we need to consider. Now, I'm going to continue going a little bit into what's the status and legal terms. We know we have the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement. Excuse me if I sound a little bit funny today, but I am under a flu, so excuse for my voice. We have the WTO Fish Subsidies Agreement, and obviously we got significant results in terms of prohibiting subsidies to the most outrageous type of subsidiation. One for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which is obviously illegal. States shouldn't be funding illegal activities. Second, provision of subsidies related to fishing on overfished stocks that are in danger or being depleted. Again, unreasonable in all terms, unjustifiable in all terms. The reason why these two were regulated is that we're getting subsidies not because the government were explicitly giving money to vessels that were engaged in illicit activities or fishing on overfished stocks. On the contrary, it happens that they subsidized the entire fleet without checking who was behaving properly and who wasn't. Okay, so that was an important element of the agreement. Finally, I think there is an important aspect of the agreement that people has underestimated, which is the provision of subsidies on the unregulated high seas. There are many regional fish management organizations, but people tend to forget that these management organizations tend to focus on the most commercial species, such as tuna, swordfish, etc. And they don't tend to focus on a significant number of species because they don't have a commercial value up to the levels to generate a common regional organization or regulation. So there are many species, example squid, that are not regulated at all. You know, so the fact that we are prohibiting subsidies to activities that are unregulated by regional fishermen organization is an important one. It also applies to regions that have not been regulated, and that applies to certain regions, for example, in the South Atlantic, that has not been regulated, and they could be also being subject to harmful activities. I continue. I won't go into detail, but you have it there in the most simple way I can do, because the texts are very complicated. Now, we're now in the phase of building negotiations that couldn't be finished in the first agreement, and that has to continue and be finished hopefully soon. In this area, we're dealing with subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. And these subsidies are in reality the lion's share of the total value of subsidies. Many experts and academia studies has mentioned that the WTO Fish Subsidies Agreement may only reduce subsidies by 12%. So we're talking about almost 90% of the subsidies are still unregulated, okay, in the fisheries sector. So now you have here the main prohibition of the treaty. This is the most significant article that basically prohibits members to maintain subsidies to fishing and fishing-related activities, but these are specific subsidies only to that sector. Okay, these are not horizontal subsidies. Fuel subsidies tend to be horizontal, for example. So obviously those subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, there is not a definition of that, but there is an illustrative list that includes all capital and operational costs. The main objective of the agreement is to deal with sustainability considerations in terms of sustainability of the stocks, but it's not considering other elements such as emissions, which is another sustainability objective. What we can see is that sometimes we are facing the complexity of addressing multiple sustainability considerations and not always being resolved at the same time. And I think this is an important lesson for all of us in the EMG. So I'll give 2 examples. For example, I have put in bold that construction, acquisition, modernization, renovation of vessels, plus purchase of cost of fuel are prohibited. But, for example, if we're going to deal with the issue of the energy transition of fishing fields, subsidies may be needed to substitute vessels from dirty ones to more energy efficiency or totally zero emissions one, if we can do that in the future, and from fossil fuel subsidies to alternative fossils of renewable nature. So see this, and this is always the devil is in the detail. There is not a qualification of fuel, for example. I think the text should have in say fossil fuels, because we may need to support the emergence of zero emissions or low emission fuels in order to reduce emissions. But I wasn't analyzed or discussed in the negotiation, so there is always a suboptimal result, even if we have good intention. But this is the long list.
A quick reminder, you're at 10 minutes now.
Ah, okay, so I'm sorry, it was very long, very detailed. So I'll go to the conclusions. You have all the text there. There are many elements there on the different tiers and different approaches in the agreement. Sorry, it's very complex, but I'll go into the conclusions then directly, if you allow me. First, I think the WTO subsidies is a significant precedent. We need to start regulating subsidies in international agreements. We have also inclusion of subsidies in the INC negotiations in plastics. So that could be the second important precedent to address this, not only in declaratory terms, but in regulatory terms. Second, we need to consolidate the ratification. We need to finalize this negotiation, and we need to do a big jump in terms of chief resource use. So moving from harmful activity to the positive ones. So this is logic 101. Sorry, let's put the money where it's needed for sustainability. Ocean economy policies, NDCs, and national adaptation plans, NBSAPs. Just to give you an idea, there are only 6 billion given by governments annually for all ocean economy activity of sustainable nature, only 6 billion, when we're spending, according to the OECD data, more than $12 billion in subsidizing fisheries. So it is illogic that more money is going to the harmful than to the positive. With that, I thank you all for the time. Have a lovely day.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David, for wrapping it up quickly and for the really concise overview of what it looks like, the fish subsidies panorama. You spoke about horizontal subsidies as opposed to perhaps sector-specific subsidies. And as I don't have any burning questions coming yet from the audience or in the chat, I just want to ask you one, which is kind of a common sense question maybe, but you know, you said fuel for the fishing vessels is not taxed, 450 million a year or more. How is that so? Is it sold in the high seas? Is it sold in ports, sort of outside of the customs zone? How does that happen that it's not taxed anywhere?
This is a very relevant question. The one that I'm mentioning in the chart is import within the countries. The reason is that for issues of competitiveness, whether of maritime transport or promoting and enabling fisheries to have low cost in their own countries, they do not tax those fuels. Okay, for those subsidies that are, for those fuels that are sold in the high seas without any tax or any regulation, we have simply no data. So we don't know the size of the problem. So the 400 million is the tip of the iceberg.
Very interesting. Okay, thanks very much, David. I was actually thinking of airplane fuel, jet fuel, which I also know isn't taxed. And so it's kind of interesting. You have this in fishing, you have this in aeronautical transportation as well, and it seems to be a bit of a lacuna. David, you still get your screen share on. We're seeing double pictures, but that's fine. Well, hopefully we get it. Thank you very much. We're going to go now to Mariano, who's going to sort of drill down on some country examples, how things have worked, how they've played out, and perhaps the work of Biofin. Mariana, over to you.
Thank you. And you can hold on the slide a little bit. Just I can send the signal to the organizing support team to show the screen. I just have one slide, Stephen. So I'm going to start my presentation, obviously thanking the invitation for this webinar, and just very quickly explaining what Biofin is for those of you who don't know. Biofin is a biodiversity finance initiative of its UNDP initiative that was launched in 2012 to support countries in mobilizing resources for biodiversity. We now work in 41 countries with 90 additional countries joining very soon. Actually, as we speak, we got funding from the GEF to support countries in developing their national finance, biodiversity finance plans. And even before the GBF was agreed upon, Biofin, one of our mandates is to track biodiversity expenditures. And I think, Stephen, you mentioned before, or somebody of the initial panelists, that the importance of tracking financial flows, that positive and negative, obviously. And one of our mandates is to share, to track biodiversity expenditures on the positive side. Initially, we were focusing more on how much was being spent mainly by the governments, but also from the private sector. And we target 18 now. We are transitioning now to also looking at the other side of the coin on how much our country is spending in potentially harmful incentives and subsidies. So we developed the guidelines that I'm going to share in a few moments, but now 10 of our countries have completed this assessment. It's a bottom-up approach. We have Biofin teams in place in our country, so they are leading this work at the country level. 20 more countries are now starting these assessments to prioritize which subsidies have the most potential to being reformed and repurposed. And now, if you can share that slide, basically the guidelines that we developed, Stephen, are very straightforward. It's focusing on doing a preliminary screening stage where we identify, first of all, what are the drivers of biodiversity at a country level, and this is linked to the Biofin methodology, but basically we need to understand what are the main drivers of biodiversity and then connect them with existing public policies, public programs, national budgets, and obviously those subsidies that are embedded in the public budgets. We then go through the research stage when we map these major subsidies, also identify the financial flows, the amount of financial resources that are translated into these subsidies. We identify who are the clients of these subsidies, because obviously, Stephen, we know when we talk about repurposing subsidies, we need to think about the social impact that transforming these subsidies will potentially have. So we need to also assess what are the beneficiaries and the stakeholders that are dependent on these subsidies. Then we move to a validation stage, and then our second biggest stage of our work is assessing, developing a roadmap, prioritizing which subsidies have the biggest potential to reform or repurpose, and then draw a roadmap to be implemented together with the government. So we work with governments through all this process, and then when we reach the implementation stage, that's when Biofin teams have a little bit of budget to start these sort of reform, repurposing, redesign processes at the country level. So now we don't need that slide anymore. By the way, these guidelines are in our website, biofin.org, so anybody can take a look at them. And I just want to share with you, Stephen, two examples. I work mainly in Latin America, but we have countries all over the world. But I want to share with you two examples from this region that are very, they really show us some of the challenges that we're facing on the ground when we think about repurposing and redesigning subsidies. The first example I bring is from Colombia, who's going to be hosting the next COP. And we started working in Colombia. I remember we were even during COVID times when Colombia got a little bit of seed capital, seed funding to start this initial assessment. We focused mainly on the agricultural sector and the livestock production. And after 2.5 years, more or less, we finished the assessment. We developed a roadmap. We prioritized which subsidies had the biggest potential for reforming. And then we partnered with one of the largest agricultural development banks in Colombia, Finagro, where they were very interested in understanding how their different credit and financial products were having an impact on nature and climate. So they were really open to working with the BioFin team in Colombia to identify which lines of credit could really support green investments to support climate benefits and also biodiversity benefits. They prioritize the livestock production value chain and also other value chains related to yuca, corn, rice, and other value chains. So we are at the process now of developing this framework so Finagro can sort of run their different financial products in order to not only to avoid negative impacts in the land and in biodiversity, but also to sort of prioritize the green investment lines of different financial products that the bank has. So we're really hoping we'll have good results. Obviously, Colombia is very interested in moving this agenda forward because they're hosting the COP. So we're very optimistic of the results we're going to get in the short term. And the second example I have is from Ecuador. We are also partnering with the finance sector, mainly with development banks. And I just want to highlight here, Stephen, the relevance of working with development banks, both multilateral and also national development banks, because they are somehow the engine behind what's happening with subsidies, and also obviously with central governments through their national budgets. But in Ecuador, we're working on these two sides of the coin that both Katia and my previous panelists mentioned, not only focusing on the negative subsidies, but also increasing positive investments. If we don't work on these both sides of the coin, we're always going to fall short. So in Ecuador, one of the main results we've achieved so far is avoiding what we call in BioFin, avoiding future costs. So they develop a strong environmental and social safeguard system or framework. So more than $100 million now have been allocated $800 million have been allocated going through this ESG framework in order to avoid negative impacts on the land, on nature, and biodiversity. So that's working sort of avoiding negative costs and avoiding negative impacts. And then we're also working on the positive side where we partner with another development bank working mainly on the what they call in Ecuador the popular and solidarity economy, supporting local communities to access finance resources for what they call green credit. So it's a positive financial product from the bank to support sustainable projects, sustainable use of biodiversity, and with no impact on climate change. So we're talking about soil restoration, we're talking about sustainable agriculture systems. So I think with these two examples, I'm just sharing with you the one thing is looking at these macro level numbers, but when you actually work on the ground with the national stakeholders, you can do a lot of things if you find the right people to work with and with the right information and baseline assessments you need. And just to close my remarks, I don't want to take a lot of time here. I do think that one of the findings we've had in the different countries we're working now is most countries do not have any monitoring systems at all of how these subsidies are having an impact in the environment. And we need to have these monitoring systems in place to facilitate countries to track the impacts that these subsidies can unintentionally have, because I don't think every government has an intention to harm their environments through these subsidies. They just want to benefit producers and local population, but we do need to put together these environmental assessment frameworks as a tool for governments to really prevent these negative impacts through the subsidy work. Thank you very much.
Super. Thanks so much, Mariana. That was really interesting to hear the 2 case studies, Ecuador and Colombia. Also, because I lived in Ecuador for 5 years. Me es muy querido este país.
Muy bien.
So, but I was thinking about it. Some of the subsidies might be implicit as well. Like if you have a policy to have food being cheap, for example, maybe cheap food is an implicit subsidy, to agriculture. What did you come across when you were looking at, for example, food pricing or pesticide pricing? Are these investment costs? Are these recurrent costs? What do you find when you look at the sort of the landscape of different instruments that are being used?
Yeah, I mean, some of our countries are focusing on. I think it was Nepal who focused on changing all the fertilizer program that they had, reducing investments to subsidize fertilizing and trying to find more environmentally friendly strategies. We haven't. I don't think we have reached or worked in any country so far in changing the structure of food prices, which is that opens a whole different dimension on local economy, basically. But I do recognize that is a critical aspect of anyone who wants to really work on subsidies. But we use one word, subsidy, Stephen, but we know it means so many different things, and at so many different scales that you need to start somewhere. And I mean, sorry, I was putting my timer so I wouldn't go off time, but basically it's a country needs to prioritize, right? Sometimes it's easier to start with the low-hanging fruits, even though we know tackling fossil fuels have the highest potential, which we know it will have, but changing the structures of subsidies, and we know there is a clientele behind subsidies, that it's been there historically in every country. So we need to go on a case-by-case basis, and also trying to find the best opportunities and entry points to start making and building the case that it's possible to change the way things are being done at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole political economy around subsidy reform, and Katia was speaking to that as well, right? The 6 key lessons that OECD was looking at, and I suspect if you look at the countries where you're working, you'll find those lessons as well. So really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Mariana. So I'll ask Philip to come in next. Philip will be sort of bringing up the end of the conversation with a very important capstone, which is climate and fossil fuel subsidies. But of course, fossil fuel subsidies spill over not only into climate, but also into nature and pollution, I would venture as well. So Philip, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm wondering if somebody could bring up my presentation for me and we can walk through it. Yeah, look, I realized too I'd be coming at the end of a relatively technical panel, and also potentially offering comments that others might have already touched on. So I wanted to stay relatively high level and focus on some issues, but I also take the comment I can speak to a couple of country level examples as we go as well, sort of where we've seen some progress on subsidy reform. So to move to a next slide and to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is what we've talked about with a lot about subsidies already is we sort of know what we're talking about here. We're talking about policy actions, and with regards to fossil fuels, one that are reducing the cost of energy purchased, reducing the cost of production, or increasing revenues retained by energy suppliers, for example, through things like direct transfer, price controls, or tax breaks. And with fossil fuels, we're often talking about them either in terms of producers or consumers. The vast majority of global fossil fuel subsidies are on the consumer side, whether it's a price control for electricity or transport fuels like petrol, or on the other hand, it can be tax breaks for oil, gas, and coal producers. For example, royalty reductions or royalty holidays that allow producers to artificially make more funding. Also coming, for example, a common one that we've seen a lot around the world is government supports for emissions reductions technology like CCS, which I'll get into, carbon capture and storage, which I'll get into a little bit later. But essentially, governments covering the cost of investments in technology or infrastructure that otherwise these companies would have to pay for on their own. To move to the next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of scale and what we're talking about, a comment was made earlier in one of the presentations about subsidies being on the way up. And certainly that is the case for fossil fuel subsidies. The overall trend of this, there's a few messages that you can see. These figures are in trillions. And we're talking about a total of fossil fuel subsidies globally of 1.5 trillion. But what you see here is that while we talk a lot about coal around the world, coal subsidies are actually by far the smallest amount of subsidies we're talking about here. We're talking about primarily petroleum products, natural gas, and electricity, each sort of roughly amount, within $100 billion, roughly around the same amount. What we're also looking at here is we're looking at the drastic increase in subsidies over that period of time, from particularly 2020 to 2022. Initially, we're talking about increases driven by COVID, where home heating costs, where we had companies that needed support for workers, and generally a lot there that then turned into subsidies related to global energy price spikes and fluctuations in 2022. So we haven't seen anything close to a return to normal in terms of energy prices and subsidies. Really, it's a dramatic increase that we've witnessed after several years of fluctuations, if overall decline, and it's now going the other way. To move to the next slide, please. I thought I'd talk a little bit about some misconceptions about subsidies and things that we hear a lot. The first one being that I spoke about it earlier, that financial supports and subsidies to reduce greenhouse gases are not fossil fuel subsidies. Well, they are. There might be a reason for some of these subsidies, and it's not inherently bad. But if you are supporting, for example, a producer of oil and gas to capture carbon that might otherwise be subject to carbon pricing, it's a subsidy. It lowers it lowers the cost of business artificially. And so these things should be classified as subsidies. And this gets into the politics a little bit, where we see a lot of hesitancy to say, well, look, we're funding emissions reductions. That's the most important thing, which might be true. But at the end of the day, if something is a fossil fuel subsidy, it should be reported and transparently categorized as one. Just because it supports emissions reductions doesn't mean it's not a subsidy. The same on tax expenditures, royalty reductions. Again, these can have the same impacts as we're talking about grants for fossil fuel producers, whether it's a direct grant, whether it's a research support or a tax expenditure. Moving to the next slide, please. This sort of gets a little bit, I talked about earlier, that all subsidies are inherently bad. We talk about fossil fuel subsidies, sorry, to go back. Not all subsidies are inherently bad. There's this feeling around fossil fuel subsidies that when we talk about fossil fuel subsidy reform, we're talking about fossil fuel subsidy removal, and they're not exactly the same thing. There might be a case for subsidies for fossil fuels that support low carbon transition. What's important, though, is that we want those to be time limited, to be reported, coming to my earlier comment, and to be transparently measured. One example I point to here is during COVID, there was a situation in Canada, in my home country, where a lot of abandoned oil wells, there was no funding for their cleanup. Now, this is normally what you would consider something that should be a polluter pays principle, but there were difficulties with the legislation at the time that basically meant that there was no funding. There wasn't sufficient funding to clean up these oil sites. So the government put in place, as part of a job protection measure, but also an environmental protection measure, a subsidy to support workers to clean up abandoned oil well sites. That's a fossil fuel subsidy. It should be reported as a fossil fuel subsidy, but it's not inherently bad. It's providing a necessary service. Going with that subsidy should be reported, it should be transparently measured, and legislation or regulation should be fixed so that we don't end up with a situation in the future where we have abandoned oil wells where there's no polluter paid funding to remediate them. And this comes to my next point about, we hear a lot at ISD, sorry, back one slide. It comes back to a lot of our work at ISD is we hear, well, look, if you're talking about removing fossil fuel subsidies, it means you're advocating for job losses and energy insecurity, job losses for fossil fuel producers and energy security for energy consumers. What we're really advocating is a way to do fossil fuel subsidy reform, not necessarily removal, in a way that supports job creation, moving workers from fossil fuel sectors to clean energy sectors and enhancing energy security. For example, making sure that when subsidies are reformed or removed, that measures are put in place to support low-income households, those who are at risk for energy security, to make sure that just because we're removing a subsidy for LPG containers doesn't mean we're removing access to energy, that alternative forms of support for energy access are provided. If you could move to the next slide, talking a little bit about the harmful impacts of subsidies, and we're looking at this fossil fuel subsidies directly and indirectly. Directly, fossil fuel subsidies undermine climate action. Through transfers, tax breaks, fuel price control measures, it's essentially incentivizing the same sort of pollution that we're trying to control through other climate mitigation measures. Rather than making pollution more expensive, these subsidies make pollution cheaper. And the common refrain is this is like raising, as a health measure, a government raising taxes on cigarettes to discourage smoking, while also giving the companies that produce cigarettes tax breaks so they can make more. They can make more profits. That's that sort of disconnection between what subsidies are and the ultimate goal of trying to address climate change. Moving to the next slide, please. These subsidies also have indirect impacts as well. For every fossil fuel subsidy, be it a consumer subsidy for purchasing petrol at below market rates, or a royalty relief to an oil, gas, or coal producer, it's disadvantaging the clean energy market. And so indirectly, it's bad for the environment as well, because you're artificially making fossil fuels cheaper and therefore more competitive against renewable energy sources that don't have these same sorts of benefits. In the long run, subsidies distort markets, pushing investment towards sectors that might not otherwise be viable. And it's troubling in the short term, stunting growth, but also in the long term, potentially creating stranded assets in the fossil fuel sector that are only viable because of the subsidies that they're subject to. Moving to the next slide, talking about subsidies and carbon pricing, I've always sort of seen them, and at ISD we see them a little bit as two sides of the same coin. And there's been a lot of progress internationally on carbon pricing, but you can't have fully effective carbon pricing without fossil fuel subsidy reform. And I have this image here of somebody bailing water out of a boat that is sinking. You have to plug the holes before you can bail the boat. And the holes in the boat are the fossil fuel subsidies. The bailing is the carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is coming in because we have high emissions, so we're attempting to reduce those emissions by pricing carbon. But if you don't fix the hole in the bottom of the boat, the pollution continues. The subsidies continue to make it cheap to create emissions and environmental impacts. And so these two measures do have to go hand in hand. Moving to the next slide.
Just a 10-minute warning here.
Okay. I have two more really quick slides. So first, remember the importance of subsidies is that the subsidies aren't put in place because we want to make it cheaper to harm the environment. They're put in place often for social goals, employment, poverty reduction. The goal is to find policy tools that deliver these goals in a way that doesn't harm the environment. To move to my next and last slide, please. We talk about repurposing subsidies to support climate action, also support those sort of social measures. An example in Indonesia from about a decade ago, there was campaigns on removing fossil fuel subsidies for electricity, fuel, and petrol to bring those energy sources to market pricing rates, but using the created revenue from the reclaimed revenue from those subsidies to invest in healthcare, which is an important poverty-related and health-related measure. And so what we talk about is not just directly moving those subsidies from fossil fuels to clean energy, but also to deliver the social goals that we want to deliver as well. as I said, a fossil fuel subsidy is not in place to make it cheaper to burn or conserve fuels. It's in place to promote poverty reduction and energy security. And the key is funding those types of goals directly, not through measures that harm the environment negatively. So I'll stop there and turn it back over. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Philip. That was really, really interesting. And, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking of something David said as well. And David, I would encourage you to throw on your screen, Katya, Mariana, because we're sort of in the closing bit here. But, you know, David, you said sustainability 101, you know, don't just let it go in the wrong way. And Mariana, you also made this point. Let's see about making it go in the right way. How do we actually turn the capital flows so that they're not distorting the prices of bads that we don't want to see anymore, but they're actually supporting goods that we do want to see? I had one sort of follow-up question for you, Philip, which is, you used a 1.5 trillion figure, and earlier we heard about a 7 trillion figure from the IMF. Can you tell us what's the difference and why?
Sure. So what we run a site called the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Tracker. I put it's listed in the slides, and you can look it up. There are different methodologies as to how we approach subsidies. And so what the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Tracker does is it brings these different methodologies together. For some, it's counting the cost of externalities. For some, it's a more, for some methodologies, it's more a count of the direct supports and tax breaks that are provided, not including those externalities or other measures. We use the term subsidies and supports often, where something might not be a subsidy by the WTO definition, which is one of the definition we abide to. But we recognize that there are different approaches to this, and you get different numbers. And so what's, you know, overall, these numbers are massive, and some of the others on the call might want to speak to them as well. But you know, it does come down to a little bit about how you count the numbers. But the benefit of the subsidy tracker is it's bringing together figures from OECD, IMF, IISD, the UN, and World Bank. So you can look at these different approaches all in one source.
Super, thanks, Philip. And that kind of reminds me of the SDG, I think it's 12C1, which talks about measuring fossil fuel subsidy reform and actually having an agreed indicator. And if I'm not mistaken, OECD was part of that effort to work on the on that methodology, because I can imagine it's very, very tough. So we're going to do wrap up. David, I'm going to go to you, but I'm also going to ask you for your take-home message. From you, we'll go to Mariana and then to Katya. Philip, I'll give you one more shot at it, and then we hand off to Hussein to bring it home. Over to you, David. On mute.
Thank you. The take-home message is, even if we're going to redirect subsidies to the right activities, we need to design them well. No, I think there are several elements of sustainability, not only environmental, and within the environmental, there are competitive ones that are not necessarily aligned, and also social elements and economic elements that we need to consider, because subsidies in the long term are not sustainable also economically. We don't have resources forever. But just a key point on the point of Philip on subsidies to consumers very quickly. The lion's share of fossil fuel subsidies are fossil subsidies to consumers. One key element in the difference of the transition we need to think and redesign subsidies is that most of those subsidies goes to the fuel themselves, okay? Which is a continuous activity of not very expensive, but spread in time, okay? In the renewable energy transition, in most of the cases, with the exception of biofuels, we're talking about capital goods that are very important in one big expense. You want to have your solar panels or your windmills or whatever energy source, and the amount of money, even if you get a subsidy, 5%, may be so big for an state or for individuals to acquire. So it's a much more different transition in terms of managing how you do those subsidies and how whoever is going to consume the renewable energy capital good is going to be able to acquire, because even if you get a 5% subsidy, you may not have the 95% needed, you know, in capital terms. So it's a very different type of investment, even in terms of subsidies terms. So we need to think about that, because it's failing in many cases, even in developing countries, because even enterprises, governments, or consumers may not have the money for the transition of the capital good. Sorry.
Yep, thanks, David. No, and that actually makes me think, you know, maybe it's harder to remove those subsidies that are actually recurrent costs, you know, because that's a day-to-day, that's existential, you know, versus a capital cost, which is, could do it, could not do it, maybe. Mariana, over to you, your take-home points, please.
I think when I mean, obviously biofilm works with biodiversity, and it's biodiversity is affected by fossil fuels, but it's such a different agenda when I hear Philip of what he's working on, whereas I think about what I do and we do in biofilms.
Loading data.
Sorry, colleague, can you mute if you're not speaking?
This is the third time.
And I always, when we think about subsidies related to biodiversity, I always kind of think of two groups, right? One, those basically agricultural producers, food producing big companies that are benefiting from these subsidies, that are not taking any consideration at all of the environmental impacts that the subsidy is having, or the production systems is having in the environment. And that's not right. We should not only tax negative incentives, but also make sure that countries have these frameworks that will enable them to not enable them to for producers and big agricultural companies to really either like compensate these negative effects. Like if I think of any other private entity that wants to build, let's say, a hotel, you need to run through a whole offset and compensation and the hierarchy of environmental impact assessments, right? But when we think about subsidies, there's no obligation to work on that. So we really need to help countries put in place these type of frameworks to assess and monitor these impacts and have options for mitigating, compensating, and avoiding these type of negative impacts to biodiversity. Thank you.
Yeah. No, very good point, especially as you were saying, I think, Philip, a lot of originally had a social purpose, right? A lot of these subsidies have a social purpose. So if you're redirecting them, you're automatically going to touch, sensitivities. Katja, over to you for your take-home messages.
So I would say, I think it would be very important for more countries to do these national level assessments. From the study we had found, there weren't that many at the time, even though under Aichi Target 3, these similar national level assessments had been requested already from now 10 years ago. And I think also that when these countries are doing these types of national level studies, they should be talking to each other on a regular basis, because it is quite complex to do it. And you can certainly learn lessons from others. And you also need to engage a wide range of stakeholders. I think maybe that's one of the most important things. Like, it can't be a small little study that is undertaken, and it needs to be interministerial. So hence you probably need a bit of political support from the top as well, because it is going to involve all the different stakeholders at the national level, or it can certainly. So you need to involve them to, and then work all together to try and also find ways, as you said. These were put in place for also social reasons. So then you need to come up and find how can you design them better, and so it needs to be done in a collaborative workspace, and you can learn from others because others have done it. Some countries are doing it on a very regular basis. Italy, for example, and I think Germany as well, they update these assessments. Italy, at least, I think, every year.
Yeah. So it is very interesting what you're saying, and also sort of learning from peers, right? So you don't have to stub your toe on the same obstacle that your neighbor stubbed their toe on. So Philip, over to you. Closing thoughts as we wrap up the session.
Yeah, I think I'll just sort of reiterate that, what you alluded to, that, these subsidies, whether they're for fossil fuels or biofuels or fishing or whatever they might be, they're often put in place either we're looking to create jobs, create economic development, encourage investments, provide energy security, reduce poverty. And so the key is, how do we deliver those goals without those subsidies? And I think that's really what is the key to reform, is looking at the impact the subsidies have, and then trying to find a way to deliver them through other means. And I think there's lots of examples that we can look to that have been successful.
Super. Thanks so much for that, Philip. That is really giving us a bit of a North Star. So how do we reach the economic goals, the social goals that don't have the unintended environmental impacts that some of the current crop of subsidies have, whether it's fish, agriculture, fuels? Hossein, we've had a great conversation here under the auspices of the EMG. Thank you so much for bringing us together. And maybe you want to say a few more words about what's to come.
Thanks a lot, Stephen, colleagues. I have been really taking a lot of notes. It's been really a load of information for me also to digest and to benefit. But I'm sure we are accumulating a lot of knowledge throughout this webinar series. And the minimum is that to make this available for colleagues in the UN or outside. I mean, from within the UN, of course, we have some ideas of what perhaps we can do about this information and knowledge and practice, to bring maybe more of them into some sort of a guidance or some sort of a narrative that can be applied by all of us in a sort of coherent manner, but also for the outside policymakers, maybe prepare, as it was mentioned by Felix, prepare the ground for some level of discussions at forums such as UN Environmental Assembly. Obviously, this has so many dimensions and it's not an easy topic. But when you look at the figures and the amounts, they are incredibly high. But the question is, how do we make this sort of communicated to countries, whether in the south or in the least developed countries, etc. So I would like to close by saying thank you to all of you who have taken again your time. We very much look forward to the second series of the dialogues, which focuses on the measuring of the impact, and that is an interesting area of understanding how do we measure it and what are the actually challenges of sort of measuring and monitoring, and actually what comes after it. What is the result of that measuring? Is it change of a policy, adoption of a policy? What are the cases for that? So we very much look forward to that second series of looking at the methodologies of measurements and so on. So very much thank you to all of you. I would very much like to see more of examples of successful examples as concrete cases in the presentations coming out. This is about socio-economic and environmental aspects. Most of the subsidies, it is known widely that it is sort of a support to sort of the especially low and mid sort of levels of the society, but often in the case, for example, when it comes to for example, loans that are offered by the banks, it is mostly the rich who have the conditions to get the loan from the bank and who actually get access to those than the poor. And it might be also the same case for the subsidies. Who is actually benefiting from the subsidies and what level of change it can bring to their life as well. So I would very much like also to look at the socio-economic aspects. I don't want to take a lot of time here, just to thank you also, Stephen, for really taking your time to moderate this. We look forward to the second. We took note of the comments which have come. We will make these materials available to the public, and we look forward to the second series to be announced very soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hossein. Thanks,
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.